In this video, we're talking about the book of Acts. The more formal name is the Acts of the Apostles. You probably know it primarily as the book of Acts. It's a familiar book to you. Most of you have probably read it, or at least some portion of it, before you ever came into this class. By this point in this class, you've read at least the first several chapters, very likely. And even as you read those chapters, there's probably things that are familiar, but we want to talk about what are some big things that you need to know about this book to get the most out of it. It's not merely can you get something. Of course you'll get something out of it. It is a powerful book in and of itself. But what are the things that you might need to know about the background, about the authorship, some key themes in the book, and really what this contributes to our knowledge of the early church. The book of Acts was written by Luke. This is the same Luke that wrote the gospel. This is the same Luke that is not an apostle himself, but is really an investigator of these things. He's been a companion of Paul. He's heard a lot of these stories firsthand, but the same that he does is he approaches his story of the gospel, the story of Jesus, which is itself its own genre. The Gospels, and a written gospel, is a unique genre in this period of the ancient world. And yet he's going to continue on really the second half of this story after the resurrection of Jesus. And really we get from Luke this origin story of the church, the spreading of the church, the maturing and expansion of Christianity in the Greco-Roman world. This is a powerful little book, and it is a history. I don't think that we're always accustomed to thinking about the book of Acts and really a lot of biblical literature. I think we sometimes do not naturally think of it as history, but that's absolutely what this is. Now, you might have a tendency or an instinct to say, well, yes, but this is a religious book, isn't it? And of course it is. But essentially, all literature in the ancient world was religious. The idea of a secular book, the idea of a secular story in the ancient world, something without supernatural phenomena, something without religious phenomena or religious relevance, is just almost unheard of. You've read Plutarch already in this class. Well, I don't know if you would know this, but just a reminder. Probably you do know this, but just as a reminder, Plutarch was a priest of Apollo. He served as one of the priests of Apollo at the temple of Apollo at Delphi. And so Plutarch himself is a priest. He's a clergyman, to use language that we would use in our own tradition. And so his own writing, right? And we can think of supernatural things and religious phenomena and all the historical work that you've gone in. If you were to go back and read Herodotus from our first semester, there is a lot in there that we could consider religious, supernatural, etc. And so this book is no different. This is a historical book. It is a historical work. Now, I'm going to say it's much more than that. It's the inspired, inerrant Word of God. But it's not anything less than that. It is a historical book. And from it, we get this, again, powerful story of really the birth of the church, especially in chapter 2, which you've read for today, very likely. But beyond there, we get to see how it spreads, especially through the person of Paul, originally Saul, when he himself becomes a convert of this faith that he had once opposed, and then goes out throughout the Greco-Roman world, planting churches, raising up leaders, just a really remarkable figure. And we get so much of Paul's backstory in the book of Acts. Now, we get Paul's writings himself in the epistles and many of the writings, these smaller works, most of them, of the New Testament. But in the book of Acts, we actually see his conversion story, his emergence as a key figure in the apostolic church, and so on. Much more that we could talk about there, but keep those things in mind as you're reading. This is a work of history. Again, it's more than that, but it's not less than that. As we get into Acts chapter 1, we get this connection to what has happened really almost immediately after, where the Gospels leave off. And there's a reason that the Gospels are ordered the way they are, and probably you've talked about that as you've gone through. But again, there's a reason that John, rather than Luke, the fact that Luke is written by the same author, you would almost think that it would be paired with Acts. But there's a reason that John is going to flow so neatly into the book of Acts, and it certainly does so. I'll provide a PowerPoint that kind of walks through some key moments, that gives you on one hand an overview and then walks through some of the key moments. I won't go through all of that here, but those things will be provided for you. I do want you to look at Acts chapter 2. Again, maybe you've read this really recently and it's fresh on your mind, so that's good. But if not, I would encourage you to take out the text and take a look at it. As we get into Acts chapter 2, verses 42 through 47 especially, we get this great little piece here, this great little picture of kind of the ethos of the early church. So on one hand, we get the historical episode when Peter will be preaching the Pentecost sermon, when large numbers of people will believe and be joined into the church that is there within Jerusalem, that it's emerging really right there in the heart of all things there in the religious capital of Jerusalem, really this heart of Jewish civilization. But then we also get this picture of the church, again, in these verses in chapter 2, a church that was compassionate, a church that was caring for their own and showing hospitality, in which they are dedicated to the teachings of the apostles and so on. And so you'll want to make sure you really take account of just alone, chapter 2 has really so much insight into the nature of the early church, and again, really this first emergence of what will become this institutionalized work, founded by Jesus. Jesus is the head, the cornerstone, the head of the church, and yet historically it's really emerging here. If we have anywhere in the New Testament that we can put kind of a chapter and verse to the emergence of the church, this is kind of it. As we get into the larger story of the book of Acts, I want you to think about this theme of pilgrims. Early Christians, we see this clearly in the book of Acts, but this is going to be the story for another 3 centuries plus, really, that Christians have an outsider status in the Greco-Roman world. They are, some of them, citizens of the Roman Empire. They are, many of them, of mixed ancestry. Gentiles will become the majority very quickly. So I don't merely mean that we're talking about Jews here living as outsiders. Jews will be part of this, and Jews are a significant part, right? All of the apostles were Jewish. Jesus was Jewish. So many of the earliest leaders are Jewish, and it's going to continue to be the case, even as we move into these later decades, even getting into the 2nd century. But having said that, there is a sense in which religiously, spiritually, theologically, that the early Christians are going to recognize and reflect on, to a significant extent, this status as outsiders. And yet what I want you to see there as you're reading through this, I think something very powerful, is on one hand, they are sojourners and strangers, to use the words of Peter himself in 1 Peter. And yet that doesn't mean that they are cowering away, hiding somewhere, but rather they are very actively preaching, teaching, discipling. Large numbers of people are coming into the church. They are pressing into the great cities of the Roman Empire, Rome itself, of course, but into other key cities like Ephesus and Thessaloniki and lots of other really powerful key cities that we see through Paul's letters, for instance. But here we get the history. We get much more of the story in Luke. And so they're going to, on one hand, yes, recognize that this earth is not their home as it is, that they are longing for a better place, as we see in the book of Hebrews and elsewhere in the New Testament. So many times we see this reflected. But at the same time, they are courageous, they are confident in the work that Jesus Christ is doing, and ultimately it allows them to, again, expand in remarkable measure. By the time we're getting into the 2nd and 3rd century, Christianity is still very much a minority faith in the empire, but it is very much drawing attention from even the highest places in the Roman Empire as it grows so rapidly. Thinking about the kind of pilgrim background, this motif that, again, the Bible's picturing for us, but even if we take the theological side of it, even if we looked at this just as a historical document, this is just a simple fact that they would have lived this way. But I love the way we can see connections to this in some of your other reading. For instance, in Ovid, we see this great theme of impermanence, right? In Ovid 15, and if I were in class, I would share this with you more thoroughly, but I do want to read this. Ovid 15 says this: "Nothing is permanent in all the world. All things are fluent. Every image forms, wandering through change. Time is itself a river in constant movement, and the hours flow by like water, wave on wave, pursuing, forever fugitive, forever new." And there's no coincidence, I think, that Christians are going to, especially as we get into the Middle Ages, really hold on to Ovid as a book that in many ways they resonate with. And this is one of the key texts, as you know by now, having read through it, that would be used even in learning the Latin language for its brilliance with Latin. But also, I think, the themes in many ways spoke to this early ethos here in these first 3 centuries or so of the early church. You can follow this theme into the 2nd century. If we were in class together, we would talk about figures like Polycarp of Smyrna and Ignatius of Antioch, Justin Martyr, and many others. You're going to get to read some of their works, and you'll get some more background on this as we go in a little bit, I presume. But this is a fascinating era of church history. And on one hand, this is a fascinating era just of Western civilization. We could broaden out and look at lots of other things going on here. But as we zero in a bit on the church here, the history of Christianity, this is an era that has drawn more interest in the last 20 to 30 years among historians, and including among Christian historians especially, that are seeing the richness, on one hand, of the theology of this era, and of the liturgy of this era, and so much that we can draw from, but also, honestly, just the impact of the stories, the biographies of great figures from this era. You'll get to read some of them as we go through. You'll get to read the Passion of Perpetua, which is not too long after this, just really a couple centuries as we get beyond this. Cyprian of Carthage is another fascinating figure. So many of these figures are going to be in North Africa, what would really have been the Carthaginian Empire, the city of Carthage that is left, now quite removed, as you know the story, with Hannibal and all of that. And yet the city of Carthage in this area of North Africa, which is Latin North Africa, this is not Greek speaking, this is a Latin portion of the region of the northern coast of the African continent. But there are so many key figures here: Tertullian, Cyprian, Perpetua, Augustine himself, right, coming from the same region. So if I were with you in class, we would take time to look at that. The last thing, and again, I'll provide these PowerPoints for you, the last thing that I'll mention is usually I would go through a visual representation of, again, this pilgrim theme that would have been a part of the story of Christianity in these first 3 centuries. And what I do is I walk you through a picture, first asking you what these pictures are, but they are the catacombs. Nearby Rome, I show some images of catacombs that in some ways are kind of representative. I don't want to make too much of the catacombs. On one hand, they're ancient burial grounds, but I think that I wouldn't have to try too hard to really be able to show some of the significance of this. These catacombs are where Christians would worship when they literally had to be underground. It was a place that they would venerate those who had given their lives as martyrs and so on. And so much that you can look through there with some of that ultimately will lead up through the 3rd century into the beginning of the 4th century, when something really remarkable is going to come on the scene that's going to, not overnight, but relatively quickly, within a generation for sure, once we get into the 4th century, into the 300s, bring not an alternative, but really a bit of a shift to the pilgrim manner of living and worldview that Christians would have had, when they will now become, on one hand, able to worship legally, and then even given some sense of favor within the Roman Empire, thanks to Constantine and to eventually his successors, with a little hiccup there later in the 4th century, which you'll get to in a lecture, I'm sure. And so a fascinating era. The book of Acts is introducing you to this story of the rise of Christianity, this story of many of them slaves, many of them the lower class, many of them without any political power and relatively little wealth. Now, there are powerful and wealthy people who are being converted as well, but by and large, the church is of humble origin in its first generations. And yet somehow, this humble group of people, many of them Jews early on, eventually Gentiles, and this very mixed group of people in this interesting cosmopolitan network of churches, somehow essentially take over the Roman Empire. Now, again, it doesn't happen overnight. And it's not as if Christians become a majority in the empire, in the 2nd century. It takes a long time for them to eventually have the sort of numerical presence that's going to be there when Constantine comes on the scene and recognizes the sheer growth of Christianity. And we'll talk about Constantine later, I'm sure, in this class. I'm sure you'll get there. But it's a fascinating thing that even with these sort of what seem to be disadvantages, Christianity turns the world upside down. How did they do this? Well, the book of Acts begins to tell us that story. I hope you enjoy it. So much more that you'll get to cover in this fascinating class. I'm sorry I can't be there with you, but I hope that you enjoy this reading and the other readings in the New Testament, and so much more that you'll get to dig into in the class, even beyond that. God bless you.